Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Isandlwana, 1879. The Anglo-Zulu War. The sun hung low over the rolling plains of southern Africa, a burnished coin in a cloudless sky. The wind whispered through the long grass, carrying with it the scent of dust, sweat, and something else, something older. Beneath the towering shape of the Isandlwana hill, jagged like the broken tooth of a sleeping beast, thousands of men were moving into position. Some wore scarlet, some wore cowhide. Most of them didn't know it yet, but many would not leave this valley alive. This was Zululand, January 1879, and the empire was about to bleed. It began, as so many disasters do, with confidence, imperial confidence, the kind born not from cruelty necessarily, but from the certainty of superiority, a belief that a line of red-coated infantrymen, armed with Martini Henry rifles and drilled in volley fire, could not be broken by mere spearmen. The Zulu kingdom, of course, saw things differently. Led by the indomitable Cetshwayo Kampande, the Zulu nation was no backwater. It was a warrior society, militarized, disciplined, and fiercely independent. Formed through generations of conquest and centralized under Shaka Zulu decades earlier, the kingdom had resisted the encroachment of both Boer settlers and British administrators with the same fierce resolve. Now it stood at a crossroads, caught between appeasement and annihilation. The British, led by Lord Chelmsford, had decided on the latter. Chelmsford, tall, proud, and carrying the weight of aristocratic lineage like a cloak, believed in fast, decisive strikes. He intended to march into Zululand, crush Cetshwayo's army in the field, and impose British control by force before the wet season closed the roads. The pretext? A carefully orchestrated ultimatum, impossible for the Zulu king to accept without surrendering sovereignty. War was inevitable, and so, on the 11th of January, the British invasion began. Chelmsford divided his forces into columns and advanced across the Buffalo River. The central column, which he led himself, numbered nearly 5,000 men, regulars of the 24th Regiment of Foot, Natal, native contingent auxiliaries, colonial volunteers, and artillery. Their first major camp was established at the foot of Isandlwana, an oddly shaped hill rising out of the plains like the back of a crouching lion. The site had no entrenchments, no wagons lagered, no earthworks built. Chelmsford didn't think they'd be needed. After all, the enemy was just a rabble with spears. Or so he thought. The Zulu impi was already on the move. Cetshwayo had ordered his commanders not to cross the border first. He still hoped to avoid the label of aggressor. But once the British had invaded, he gave his warriors free rein to respond. And respond they did. An army of over 20,000 men began marching in disciplined silence, barefoot yet relentless, carrying shields of ox hide and stabbing spears, the famed Ikalwa. They wore feathers, cowtails, and white tufts in their hair, the regalia of regiments, the dress of warriors prepared to kill and die. At their head were veterans of prior campaigns, men who had fought the Swazi, the Sotho, and other tribes, men who knew war intimately, men who had trained since boyhood for the day they would wash their spears. On the night of the 21st, they lay hidden in the Ngwebeni Valley, just a few kilometres from the British camp at Isandlwana. Undetected. Waiting. At dawn on the 22nd of January, Chelmsford made a fateful decision. Reports had come in suggesting Zulu movements to the east. Convinced that the main impi was there, he split his force, taking over 2,500 men to scout and engage what he believed was the enemy's main body. He left behind a detachment of roughly 1,700, including B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Polaine, a man trained in administration, not battle. Later that morning, reinforcements under Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived from the south, a seasoned officer, but technically outranked by Polaine. The command structure became murky. Orders were vague. And then the first Zulu scouts appeared on the surrounding ridges. Durnford rode out with 500 mounted men to chase them off, believing, as Chelmsford did, that the Zulus were probing, retreating, avoiding a fight. He was wrong. The impi had been discovered, prematurely. Some of the Zulu regiments had been spotted by mounted scouts from Durnford's party, and fearing the element of surprise had been lost, the commanders gave the order. The great crescent unfurled. The chest surged forward, the horns swept around the flanks, and the ground itself began to tremble. Imagine it, the sound of 20,000 men running in unison, shields thudding against bodies, the rhythmic shk of spears held tight, dust clouds rising, war cries swelling from a distant murmur to a deafening roar. For the British camp at Isandlwana, it must have felt like the sky was falling. Polaine scrambled to form a firing line. Companies of the 24th stretched thin across nearly a kilometre, rifles raised, orders shouted. The Martini Henry was a brutal weapon at range, single shot, lever action, 45 caliber. It barked like a cannon and kicked like a mule. In trained hands it was devastating. Volley after volley slammed into the oncoming Zulus. Bodies fell. The line held. For a while. But there was a problem. A fatal one. The ammunition. It was packed in wooden crates, each sealed with a brass screw, issued by the quartermaster in small controlled batches. No sense of urgency. No system adapted for the tempo of a full-scale assault. As the firing intensified, runners scrambled back and forth. Some boxes wouldn't open fast enough. Others never arrived. The rifles began to fall silent, not for lack of courage, but for lack of cartridges. The Zulus kept coming. By mid-afternoon, the British line was buckling. The Natal native contingent, poorly armed and demoralised, broke first. The left flank collapsed. Then the centre. What had begun as orderly rifle fire gave way to chaos. Officers tried to rally men with bugle calls, with shouted orders, with drawn sabres. But it was too late. The horns of the impi had closed. The British companies, now fragmented, were isolated and surrounded. Some stood their ground, shoulder to shoulder, until the last bullet was fired. Others were overrun in the panic. The battle turned to butchery. The Ekelwa was not a throwing spear. It was meant for stabbing, short, brutal, precise. In the press of bodies it was devastating. Soldiers fell with punctured lungs, torn throats, slashed bellies. There were no bayonets left to meet them, just fear and blood. Near the ammunition wagons, a small group made a desperate stand. Quartermasters and drivers fought with pistols, knives, even tent poles. They died where they stood. Others tried to flee, towards the Buffalo River, towards the Natal border. Few made it. Some were caught and cut down in the open. Others drowned trying to cross the river, uniforms dragging them beneath the current. Out of the 1,700 men left in camp that morning, nearly 1,300 were dead by sunset. The hill of Isandlwana, once just a landmark, now loomed over a field of corpses. The Zulus, weary but victorious, did not gloat. This was not a triumph they had sought. They buried their dead, gathered the weapons they could carry, and began the long march back. Some British bodies were disemboweled, not out of cruelty, but as part of a spiritual practice to free the soul. But to the Empire it looked like savagery. and the revenge would be swift. The shockwave of Isandlwana echoed across the empire. Never before had a modern European army, equipped with rifles, artillery, and military discipline, been so completely destroyed by indigenous forces in open battle. London was stunned, the press raged, politicians scrambled for answers, and in Chelmsford's camp, still scouring the countryside for a Zulu army that had already struck, there was disbelief, then fury, then a hunger for redemption. He would have it. The sun had barely set on the bloodied slopes of Isandlwana when the survivors began to stumble in. Ghosts in red and khaki, blackened with powder, soaked in river mud, wide-eyed with the horror they'd left behind. They brought no triumph, no banners, no wounded comrades limping beside them. Only silence, and the story of a massacre. A few of Chelmsford's men, those still in the field with him to the east, would hear the news in fragments. Rumours passed between pickets, muted disbelief. Some laughed it off at first. Impossible, they said. The Zulus wouldn't dare. But as the reality of it set in, as riders galloped back to report the camp gone, the colours lost, the dead uncountable, a different mood settled over the column. Not fear, not yet. Shame. And then rage. Back at Rorke's Drift, a tiny missionary station on the Natal side of the Buffalo River, a garrison of barely 150 men received the same news around 3 p.m. They didn't have much time to react, because the Zulus were coming. A reserve force, the Udloko, Ingabamakosi, and Uthulwana regiments, around 4,000 strong, had been held back from the main battle at Isandlwana. Hungry for glory, they crossed into British territory, heading straight for the drift. It was little more than a chapel, a hospital, and a storehouse, surrounded by a few dry fields and a makeshift cattle kraal. No fortifications, no trenches, and a single company of the 24th Foot, B Company, commanded by Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. Both men had no illusions about what was coming. They began building defences with whatever they could find. Mealie bags, biscuit boxes, overturned wagons, walls barely chest height. In places, just rubble and timber lashed with wire. Not enough, but it would have to do. By 4:30 p.m, the first Zulu scouts had been sighted. Within the hour, the attack began. Wave after wave descended on the station, the warriors darting forward in bursts, spears raised, war cries in their throats. The defenders responded with a disciplined wall of rifle fire. Again the Martini Henry barked and kicked. A flash, a crack, a scream. The line held, but the pressure never ceased. The Zulus were agile, ducking and weaving, feinting left and surging right. Some reached the barricades and clawed their way over. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted among the stores and courtyards. One British soldier, Private Henry Hook, a habitual shirker known more for malingering than valour, found himself in the hospital as Zulus breached the outer wall. The wounded were trapped, screaming, helpless. Hook grabbed a rifle, then an axe. He and a few others held the wardroom door as spears stabbed through the timber. Then they began hacking through the walls of the hospital itself, dragging wounded men from one room to the next, fighting all the while. The air was thick with smoke and blood and splinters, and the screams didn't stop. Outside, the defenders were being pushed back, metre by metre. When the outer wall could no longer be held, Chard ordered a retreat into the inner perimeter, a smaller enclosure near the storehouse. Every step was contested. Men were pulled down over the walls, stabbed, shot, beaten with rifle butts. One private was seen standing atop a barricade, swinging a club like a man possessed, blood streaking his face. Another, shot through the arm, reloaded with his teeth and shoulder, but they did not break. As night fell, the flames from the hospital lit the scene in eerie orange. Shadows danced on every wall. The cries of the wounded were joined by the ululations of the Zulus, a song of battle, of triumph, of defiance. But the rifles still spoke. All night, the defenders poured fire into the dark. The Zulus launched attack after attack, probing, pressing, sometimes getting through. Bayonets flashed, sparks flew from the barrels. The very earth seemed to shudder with the violence of it. By dawn, it was over. The Zulus withdrew. No clear reason why. Perhaps it was the sheer stubbornness of the British line. Perhaps they believed Chelmsford's column was returning. Perhaps they'd simply bled enough. The station was in ruins. Walls collapsed. Blood pooled in the dust. 17 defenders were dead. Dozens wounded. But they had held. 150 men had fought off an army. The Empire pounced on the story. In London, where the horror of Isandlwana had shaken public confidence in imperial might, Rorke's drift became the balm. The headlines screamed of gallantry, of heroism, of the thin red line holding against a barbarian horde. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, more than in any other single engagement in British history. Chard and Bromhead were fated. Hook became a celebrity. The survivors were paraded through towns as proof that British courage could not be extinguished. Isandlwana was buried beneath the headlines. But not forgotten. Chelmsford, meanwhile, was a man on borrowed time. He knew the stain of Isandlwana would follow him. He needed a victory, fast. Over the next few months he reorganised. Reinforcements poured in from across the Empire. Fresh regiments from England, artillery, cavalry, logistics, tents, rail lines, telegraphs. This time there would be no underestimation, no mistakes, no mercy. Chelmsford marched again, determined to bring Cetewayo to heel, to crush the Zulu resistance and reclaim imperial pride. The war shifted gears, from colonial expedition to retribution. But Cetewayo still hoped for peace. He sent envoys, messages, pleas, asking for terms. He had not wanted war. He had not attacked British soil first. He had told his warriors not to pursue beyond the river. But now the Empire wanted punishment. No treaties, no negotiation, just conquest. And so the Zulu impis gathered again, not with the same vigour, not with the same faith. Their losses at Isandlwana had been heavy. Their failure at Rorke's drift had stung. Yet they fought on. Over the next months, more battles flared. Kambula, Gingindlovu, Eshowa. Some were Zulu victories, most were not. The weight of imperial force, the rifles, the artillery, the supply lines became overwhelming. And then, in July, the British found what they were looking for. Cetewayo had taken refuge near Ulundi, the royal kraal, deep in the heart of Zululand. He was guarded by what remained of his regiments, veterans and raw recruits alike, gathering for one final stand. On the 4th of July, 1879, Chelmsford advanced with a massive column, nearly 5,000 men, bristling with firepower. This time the camp was fortified, square-largered wagons, rows of rifles, Gatling guns. The Zulus charged once more, proud, fearless, undaunted, and they were cut down by hundreds, then thousands. In less than an hour, the charge collapsed. The battlefield was littered with bodies, proud shields broken, spears cast aside. Ulundi burned, and with it, the Zulu kingdom. Cetewayo was captured weeks later, imprisoned, humiliated, taken to Cape Town in chains, then eventually to London. He would be paraded before dignitaries and sketched for the papers, dressed in a suit, sitting stiffly in carriages, the warrior king. Reduced to curiosity, the kingdom was dismantled, divided, its authority broken. British officials carved up Zululand into chiefdoms, loyal to the crown, igniting civil war among the Zulu themselves. The empire called it peace, but it was conquest by any other name. And yet, Isandlwana remained. A wound, a memory, a battlefield littered with bones and shattered rifles. The hill still stood, silent now, watching. And on its slopes the cairns began to appear, small white mounds of stone, raised by survivors and burial parties, each one covering what they could. No grand monuments, no polished plaques, just stones, stacked by hand, and beneath them, men who had fought not out of ideology or hatred, but out of duty. Redcoats and Zulu alike. Today, Isandlwana is quiet. There are no cries of battle, no thunder of rifles, only wind. It moves through the long grass that once swallowed the charging impi. It whispers around the cairns, pale mounds of stone, scattered like bones across the hillside, and if you listen closely, it almost speaks. This is where the empire bled, and where memory refuses to die. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the British declared victory. Zululand was partitioned, its kingship abolished, its warriors disbanded. But the cost had been immense. The invasion had begun with confidence, arrogance even, a belief in racial and military superiority. It ended with blood-soaked humility. Isandlwana had shattered the illusion. It had shown that modern firepower could fail. That native resistance, when well led and well motivated, could shake an empire to its core. It was a lesson that would echo, though not always be heeded, in campaigns across Africa, India, and beyond. For the Zulus, the legacy was even more painful. Cetshwayo, though eventually released, never regained his kingdom. He died in exile, likely poisoned. A man of great dignity, trapped between two worlds. Too Zulu for the British, too diplomatic for the warriors who had once followed him. The civil wars that followed tore the kingdom apart. Chiefs installed by the British turned on one another, old loyalties fractured. Generations of social structure and military discipline unravelled in less than a decade. What had been a rising regional power was reduced to a memory. And yet the Zulu name endured, not in defeat, but in legend. The bravery of the warriors at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift became the stuff of fireside stories and ancestral pride. Songs were composed, regiments remembered, family lines traced back to the fallen. To this day, the Zulu regimental system is echoed in cultural gatherings and royal rituals. Shields are still raised, spears still borne, not in war, but in remembrance. Because for all that was lost, identity remained. On the British side, the war became part of the tapestry of imperial law. The disaster of Isandlwana was reframed, not as a blunder, but as a noble tragedy. A gallant last stand. The defence of Rorke's Drift was mythologized even further, bolstered by the flood of Victoria Crosses and, a century later, by cinema. The 1964 film Zulu, starring Michael Caine, etched the story into the popular imagination. Stoic redcoats, endless waves of charging warriors, a clash of civilizations. It was dramatic, stirring, but deeply selective. It sanitized the war, romanticized it, made it clean. Real war, of course, is never clean. What was often omitted, in history books and films alike, was the root cause of the conflict. Expansion, greed, the belief that Britain had the right, even the duty, to rule foreign peoples. Cetshwayo had not provoked the war. He had been provoked. The ultimatum delivered by Sir Bartle Frere in late 1878 demanded the dismantling of the Zulu military system and the submission of the king's authority to British overlords. It was designed to be rejected, a pretext. The war was not about defence, it was about empire. And in that light, Isandlwana was not a tragic mistake. It was a reckoning. But war never stays still. The British Empire would march on to Egypt, Sudan, Afghanistan, South Africa again. And each time it would carry with it the lessons of Zululand. Never underestimate the enemy. Secure your supply lines. Fortify your camp. Respect the terrain. But another lesson, the moral one, would be much harder to learn. That technology does not equal justice. That conquest is not civilization. And that the people fighting for their land are never simply the enemy. Walk the battlefield today, and you'll see that time has done its work. The wagons are gone, the gun smoke has cleared, the bones have long been buried. But the ghosts remain. British tourists stand beneath the hill, reading plaques, tracing unit positions. Zulu descendants gather for ceremonies, some still wearing traditional regalia, drums echoing through the dust. Two peoples, one battlefield, a shared memory viewed from different sides. And that is what history is. Not just a ledger of dates and battles, but a tapestry of voices, some loud, some silenced, all still woven into the present. The Battle of Isandlwana was not the end of the Zulu nation. It was not the end of empire either, but it was a moment, brief and blazing, when the impossible happened. When shields overcame rifles, when pride became tragedy, when the hill roared and then fell silent. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.